Inscriptions are the most important body of written material that has survived directly from the ancient Greek world through to the present day. Primarily on stone, but also on other materials such as ceramic, bronze, and lead, well over 20,000 are extant from ancient Athens and Attica, around a fifth of the total number of ancient Greek inscriptions known, and much the largest regional corpus. On average, around 50 new Attic inscriptions are discovered and published every year. Athens was, more than any other Greek city, a verbal city, a city of the word, spoken and written. As every classicist knows, a disproportionate quantity of surviving Greek literature was written by Athenians or in Athens. The first three great historians of the Western tradition, Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon, were either Athenians or worked at Athens. And the same applies to the first four great playwrights of the Western tradition, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes, to the first two major figures of Western philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, and to the 10 orators who, for the rest of antiquity, were looked to as models of how to persuade with words in political assemblies or law courts. All worked at Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. This verbal propensity, however, is also manifest in inscriptions. Despite the abundance of literary evidence relating to Athens, well over 90% of the individual residents of ancient Athens and Attica known by name are known from inscriptions. Together with the abundant literary evidence, this makes Athens into much the most knowable ancient Greek city, enabling its history to be written across a span of time and in a depth and detail that is unique in the Greek world and otherwise usually possible only for more modern polities. Psiphismata, commonly translated decrees, but literally things voted or decisions, made by all sorts of groups of citizens, were recorded on stone, from contingents of soldiers through demes, tribes, and other groups within the city, to the Council of 500 and the Citizen Assembly. Assembly decrees, many of them awarding honours to individual benefactors, start being inscribed in significant numbers around the middle of the 5th century BC, and most of them were set up on the Acropolis. From the middle of the 5th century to the end of the 4th century BC, about 1,000 inscribed decrees of the assembly are extant, supplying fundamental evidence for the political life of the city and the workings of the classical Athenian democracy. Accounts and inventories form a second major category. Public accountability was a fundamental principle of the Athenian democracy, and this is manifest nowhere more clearly than in the epigraphical record. Dedications, which usually carry much shorter text than decrees and accounts, are a third category. Comprehending a multifarious range of objects, the surviving inscription is either on the objects themselves or more often on bases which originally supported statues and other objects in bronze, now lost. They were typically dedicated in religious sanctuaries as gifts to the gods, seeking or acknowledging divine favor, but include also monuments such as public statues erected in the agora and bases carrying tripods commemorating victories in performance competitions at Athenian festivals. By far the most numerous category of Attic inscription, however, are the funerary monuments, with a culture of public commemoration in the 5th century, particularly of war dead, characterized by long lists of casualties, giving way in the last quarter or so of the 5th century to the classical style of private monument, many of them with figurative relief, displaying the characteristic greeting or handshake scenes, dexiosis. After the funerary legislation of Demetrius of Phaleron, 317 to 307 BC, of whom more later, these styles are supplanted by the abundant, modest, undecorated short stone pillars, columella or kioniskoi, inscribed simply with the name of the deceased. A revival of the classical figurative style emerged in the Roman period. From this briefest of sketches, I hope it will be clear that inscriptions are a potential goldmine for the historian. But there is a problem in that they have commonly been regarded as difficult and inaccessible to the non-specialist. Partly this is a function of the nature of the material. Very large and ever-increasing numbers of discrete items, often fragmentary and difficult to read, many with long and complex bibliographies. Partly, however, it has been a function of how the material is presented. Before Attic Inscriptions Online came onto the scene, the international system for the publication of Attic inscriptions had three essential components. Volumes 1 and 2 of Inscriptiones Graecae, IG, the internationally authoritative corpus published since 1815 by the Berlin Academy, and now progressing through its third edition. SEG, the Supplementum Epigraphicum Graecum, an annual digest of epigraphical publications designed to fill the gaps between different editions of IG, and the online PHI, Packard Humanities Institute database of Greek texts of inscriptions. The IG volumes contain Greek texts and apparatus and commentaries in Latin. The prime objective is to supply the best possible textual editions. IG assumes that its readers know Latin and Greek and are epigraphists or at least scholars of a traditional kind working in a library, preferably a financially rather well-endowed one. The hard copy volumes are very expensive. Its commentaries are very spare and factual. A welcome development in the 21st century is that IG has begun to publish photographs in the hard copy volumes, but in the printed copies there are no translations into any modern European language, though IG has begun now to publish translations online, another very welcome development. SEG, the Supplementum Epigraphicum Graecum, the annual digest, has been published in English since 1976. It was in Latin before that. But there are no translations offered. There are gaps in coverage, especially for the early 1970s. There is normally a time lag of 3 years or so between publication and registration of an item in SEG. There is an expensive and, I must say, not entirely user-friendly website. And SEG's mission is to record rather than to adjudicate. Again, its target readership is mostly epigraphists or already well-informed scholars. The PHI database supplies searchable access to Greek texts of inscriptions. It's an extremely useful scholarly tool. But again, there are no translations, no annotation of any kind, and it has a tendency to be a little out of date. For example, the latest SEG covered in the PHI database is SEG 47, which was produced in 1997, or covers the publications of 1997, more than 20 years ago now, so it's 20 years out of date. IG, SEG, and the PHI database serve a particular scholarly community well, but it is a relatively narrow specialist community envisaged as working in a very well-equipped library. I firmly believe, and this is a quotation that you've already heard this evening from John, I firmly believe that Attic inscriptions are historical sources of the first importance and that there is a much broader potential readership for them than has conventionally been reached by the existing established publications. A certain amount can and has been done by volumes of selected epigraphical highlights. Peter Rhodes and Robin Osborne's collection of Greek historical inscriptions of 404 to 323 BC does an exemplary job in presenting key inscriptions in a historically informed and engaging manner for students and scholars, with translations and full informative commentaries. Their new volume of 5th century inscriptions, which has just appeared, and is designed as a replacement for the later parts of Meggs and Lewis's well-known collection, is equally valuable. but the total number of Attic inscriptions contained in these 2 volumes is about 100. There are well over 20,000 Attic inscriptions in total, and with the exception of the hopelessly fragmentary, there is scarcely one of these that does not have some historical value on its own or as part of a group. Against this background, the most important element missing from the publication systems for Attic inscriptions, and the most pressing need in making those inscriptions accessible to a wider readership, seem to me to be annotated translations into English, English as the modern European language in most widespread use globally. And it is English translations that are accordingly the centerpiece of the website I launched just over 5 years ago now, in December 2012, Attic Inscriptions Online. The argument in favor of translations of inscriptions seems to me to be unanswerable. Translations are available for every other type of historical source written in Latin and Greek. Even papyri, which are similar to inscriptions in often being fragmentary, are conventionally published with accompanying translations. Why should inscriptions be different? It's a long time since the group of those with an excellent knowledge of ancient Greek and Latin has overlapped more or less precisely with the group of those with a serious interest in the ancient world in general, and ancient Athens in particular. And by those with a serious interest, I mean to include students from school through to postgraduate level, members of the general public, for example, visitors to museums, and researchers into the ancient world who are not classicists, researchers, that is, whose primary interest is in inscriptions is in their content rather than in their language, including historians and archaeologists, anthropologists, sociologists, and political scientists. And I mean also to include those whose Latin and Greek is quite adequate, but who want quick and easy access to the sense of the latest available version of a particular text. Of course, a certain amount of semantic content is lost in translation, but the vast majority of the original sense that is of interest to the historian can be rendered quite adequately. Insofar as there is a semantic shortfall, one feature which we have included on AIO to help alleviate this is transliterations of the original Greek words and phrases. One of the cases in which we include transliterations is precisely where there is important semantic content in the original which is impossible to render fully or accurately in English. And we use them also where particular problems of rendering sense are presented by the fragmentary character of a preserved text. Many of these transliterations may be useful only to those with a certain knowledge of Greek, but they can be useful even if that knowledge is very slight. To take a value term that is not precisely translatable into English, one can explain, and indeed I've done so many times, for example, perfectly well to a group of students without knowledge of Greek, what the meaning is of philotimia, and it can be useful for those students to be made aware by means of transliteration of occurrences of the word and its cognates in honorific decrees. This, I think, enhances the understanding of the text a step further than imprecise translations by themselves, such as love of honor or ambition, and helps address the problems presented by occurrences of cognates, such as philotimomenos, which are translatable only cumbersomely, if at all, into English. It enables verbal connections to be traced through the translation, even if the actual words used in the translation are not the same. AIO also includes direct links to Greek texts of the inscriptions translated on the PHI or IG online websites. You can see the links highlighted in red on this screen upper right. See one IG online and one PHI link. This is intended, of course, to be useful to users of AIO who have knowledge of Greek, but like the transliterations, it may perhaps also serve to remind the user of the translation that there is an underlying Greek text and draw them into thinking about that. The Attic corpus is not only the largest of the regional Greek corpora, it is also, I would think, the most fluid, with the discovery of new inscriptions, new joins, and other kinds of epigraphical progress being made continuously. An online publication such as AIO can, of course, reflect this much more easily than hard copy modes of publication, which are out of date the moment they are published. We give references in AIO not only to the date the translation was first added to our site, but also the date the translation was last updated. You might be able to see that at the bottom right-hand side corner of the screen. Added 15th of September 2017, updated 16th of September 2017. That means that we spotted a mistake on the day after we originally published it and corrected it immediately. And underneath the date references, there is a feedback button. You'll see that red button which says feedback, so that when the visitor to our site notices that a correction or update is needed, or indeed if they have any other kind of query, they can send an email direct to us at AIO. To be really useful, an online translation needs, of course, to be supported by metadata. Apart from key bibliographical references, each translation on AIO includes a date and what seem to us to be the most important metadata: monument type, stele, base, altar, etc., inscription type, decree, dedication, account, find spot, original location where known, and present location, including museum inventory numbers, along with annotation in the form of side notes keyed to relevant points in the translation. The annotation is continually being enhanced and expanded. Last but not least, place names are linked to the Pleiades mapping database, and we include links to images of the inscriptions on external sites. It's now possible to browse the inscriptions not only by source reference, but by a full range of other variables. Date, you'll see they're listed down the right-hand side of the page there. Date, find spot, inscription type, monument type, original location, present location, publication date on AIO. And there's also facilities to search for words or strings of words, both in the translation itself and in the notes. AIO also has its own series of academic papers, AIO papers, which, broadly speaking, support the translations on the site. The original idea behind these was to act as a vehicle for explaining and justifying cases where the text we translate on AIO differs from published texts, but the papers also support and complement the site more broadly. The most recent, displayed on the screen there, AIO Papers 8, published last summer in both online and hard copy versions, presents translations of two key inscriptions of the 5th century Athenian Empire, the decree imposing a settlement on Chalkis following a revolt, and the decree of 4254 BC providing for a reassessment of the tribute of the Athenian Empire, with much more extensive contextual discussion than there is space for in our usual side notes. The paper is designed to be useful not only to researchers and university students, but also to students in British schools studying the new A-level ancient history syllabus, for which these two inscriptions are set texts. We now have around 1,200 translations on our site, mostly substantial texts. A fair start, I think, for the first 5 years of our existence, but we are very much aware that we still have a long way to go. Two major developments to the structure of the site are in the pipeline. First of all, a facility to post Greek texts and images of inscriptions translated directly on the site, which we shall use, for example, in cases where up-to-date Greek texts of the inscription are not otherwise available online. And we plan also this year to undertake a redesign of the homepage to include images and generally make it more slick with more use of drop-down menus and such like. We are delighted to be collaborating with our colleagues in the Greek Epigraphical Society on the creation of a modern Greek sibling to AIO, Greek Inscriptions Online, GIO, which will present modern Greek translations of key inscriptions from across the Greek world. As far as content is concerned, expansions in the pipeline include coverage of the new IG dedications volumes, over 1,700 inscriptions currently being worked on by a team of doctoral students and postdocs. The translations currently being worked on by a team of doctoral students and postdocs. And also AIO Papers number 9, which will collect 33 major Athenian laws and decrees of the first half of the 4th century BC. Be an update essentially of Rhodes and Osborne's coverage of that in their 4th century volume nearly 20 years ago now. In October, we started work on Attic inscriptions in UK collections, AIUK, a project supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council to publish on AIO fresh editions with translations and photographs of the 250 Attic inscriptions in UK collections. Most of these are in the British Museum, but there are also smaller collections in Oxford and in Cambridge, and in a scattering of local museums and country houses. One of the collections we shall be publishing in the context of AIUK is that here in the BSA. And here, those of you who have the handout and are interested in following the detail might wish to refer to the handout. These inscriptions in the BSA were already quite familiar to me, as I worked on them 20 years ago for an edition of them in the BSA Annual for 2000. But looking at them again this last autumn, I've been struck by the extent to which it has been possible to move forward our understanding of several of them in their historical context from where I left them in 2000. Most of the BSA's collection of inscriptions is Attic, and most of them were once in the possession of George Finlay, the British Philhellene who lived in Greece in the early 19th century around the time of Greek independence, latterly in a house in Athens, in Adrianou. I've listed the Attic inscriptions in the BSA on the handout, including in bold type a note of key relevant new work that has appeared since my edition of 2000. As you can see, the first two inscriptions on the list are decrees of the Athenian Assembly, both honorific and both dating to the last decades of the 4th century BC. And the first of these is the prize epigraphical exhibit in the BSA's collection, the only substantial decree of the Athenian Assembly that survives from the decade 317 to 307 BC, when Athens was controlled by Demetrius of Phaleron in the interests of Cassandros. By coincidence, another fragment of the same inscription is also in British hands in the British Museum, and you'll see on the screen on the right-hand side the BSA fragment unlocated, thanks to the trick of the camera, beneath the fragment which is actually in the British Museum. And that's, you'll see there's a fault mark running quite clearly from one to the other, making it absolutely crystal clear that the two fragments belong together. This has been known for a long time. The decree documents an episode in the wars between the successors of Alexander the Great and the honorandis Asandros of Macedon, satrap of Caria, and at the time of this decree, an ally of Cassandros, Seleucus, and Ptolemy against Antigonos. But I'm not going to talk in detail about that aspect of the decree today. The inscription is key evidence for the character of Demetrius's regime and figures largely in O'Sullivan's recent analysis of that topic. Plutarch characterized the regime as nominally an oligarchy, but in practice a monarchy, echoing Thucydides' famous description of Periclean Athens as in theory a democracy, but in practice dominated by one man. Though on Demetrius's own account in the memoirs he wrote after his fall from power, he had not only not destroyed the democracy, but even rectified it, ten demokratian epen orthosi. Formally, the regime was moderately oligarchic, with active citizenship limited to those possessing more than 1,000 drachmas. Now you'll see that there is no reference in the prescript or anywhere else in the decree to a secretary, and the usual clause providing for the inscribing of the decree is also missing. This probably implies that it and the statue it provided for were erected at private initiative and expense, and as I said, it's the only substantial preserved inscribed decree surviving from these years. It would seem that under Demetrius, the city ceased inscribing decrees at public expense. This was probably driven by an impetus in part to cut unnecessary public expenditure, and more particularly perhaps to limit competitive display, and should be seen against the background of an accelerating epigraphical habit in previous decades and the curtailment of other types of inscribed monument under Demetrius, including the replacement of figurative funerary monuments with the more modest funerary columella that characterize Hellenistic Athens, and the cessation of the increasingly extravagant forms of choregic commemoration that had appeared since 338 under both democratic and oligarchic regimes. No simplistic correlation can be drawn between democracy and a propensity to inscribe decrees. Decrees had continued to be inscribed under the previous, ostensibly more extreme oligarchy of 322 to 318. But the practice of inscribing predominantly honorific decrees had, since the 340s, increasingly become an expression of elite competitive display, which will have sat uncomfortably with the political philosophy of Demetrius, who was a peripatetic and pupil of Theophrastus. Perhaps even more uncomfortably from an elite philosophical perspective, increasing numbers of ordinary Athenians were having their tenure of democratic offices commemorated by inscribed decrees. In the last phase of the classical democracy, it became a rhetorical topos to draw attention to a lamentable proliferation and devaluation of honorific decrees, and among the satirical characters sketched significantly by Demetrius's teacher, Theophrastus, is one on the seeker after petty honors, Mikrophilotimos. Despite the ostensibly oligarchic character of the regime, this decree shows that the institutional infrastructure of the democracy, of the council and assembly, remained in place. Particularly noteworthy is that the decree is non-probuleumatic, which is indicated by the wording dedochthai to dermo in lines 10 to 11, rather than dedochthai te boule kai to dermo, implying that its provisions were formulated in the assembly and were not simply a rubber stamping of a probuleuma formulated by the council. The interest of ordinary Athenian citizens is engaged by the decree implicitly and explicitly. Asandros had looked after Athenian citizens who, for the most part, no doubt by reason of the fortunes of war, had visited his territories. He had placed his own ships and soldiers at Athenian disposal and had taken steps to ensure the safe return home of Athenians at his own cost. The formulations are conventional, but they are not hollow. Securing the safe return of citizens in adversity was especially likely to result in expressions of the Assembly's gratitude, regardless of the complexion of the prevailing constitution. The decree is also of great interest as the earliest well-preserved inscription recording an award at Athens of the so-called highest honours, megistai timai, perpetual dining rights in the city hall, citasis in the Prytaneon, priority seating at competitive festivals, and a bronze statue. And this is a topic which has been extensively discussed since my 2000 edition, and some of the key bibliography, for those of you interested, is on the handout at the bottom of page 2. Earlier cases of such awards are known only from the literary record or very fragmentary inscriptions. The archetype for them is the tyrannicides Harmodios and Aristogeiton, whose murder of Hipparchus, son of Pisistratus and brother of the tyrant Hippias, in the late 6th century, led indirectly to Cleisthenes' democratizing reforms, and who were awarded posthumous honorific statues in the Agora at some point between 510 and the 480s BC. As you will see from the end of this decree, Asandros may erect his statue anywhere he wishes in the Agora except by Harmodios and Aristogeiton, a prohibition which expresses a long-standing conception of the heroic achievements of the pair, not only as archetypal and democratic, but in a class of their own. Azoulay, in his 2014 book, intriguingly suggests that the prohibition may reflect a differentiation between royal figures, who, in the case of Philip II and Alexander, may already have been granted statues close to Harmodios and Aristogeiton, and Azoulay bases that on Pausanias' description of their location, and subordinate ones such as Asandros, not a sovereign, merely a satrap, who are required to keep their distance from Harmodios and Aristogeiton. There may also have been a religious aspect to the prohibition. We are told that the polemarch offered enagismata to Harmodios and Aristogeiton, a term indicating offerings designed to counteract the potential hostility or pollution of the dead. It is not clear whether the enagismata were offered at the statues themselves, but regardless of whatever the case is in that regard, the Harmodios and Aristogeiton seem to have required likenesses of other human benefactors to maintain an awesome distance, despite, or perhaps precisely because of, the similarity of the honours being awarded to their own. A similar prohibition appears somewhat later in the decree of 2954 BC honouring one Herodorus. Azoulay notes that he too was not a sovereign. According to the literary record, however, just a few years later than our decree, after Demetrius of Phaleron was ousted, the Athenians erected golden statues on a chariot, Epharmatos, of his enemies and successors in control of Athens, Antigonus and his son Demetrius Poliorcetes, precisely near Harmodios and Aristogeiton. This incidentally suits Azoulay's theory, as Antigonus and Demetrius, like Philip and Alexander, were sovereigns. For lack of evidence, as I say, this is the earliest well-preserved inscribed case of the award of the highest honours at Athens. The past history of this restriction on the location of honorific statues before Asandros' decree is obscure. But in the context of Demetrius of Phaleron's regime, I would suggest that the respectful reference to Athens' quintessential democratic heroes bespeaks a sense of continuity with and respect for the city's democratic heritage, consonant with other aspects of the decree's wording, and with Demetrius' own claim to have set the democracy right. This aspect of honorific practice continued to resonate powerfully in both the short and the much longer term. In 42 BC, following the assassination of Julius Caesar, Brutus and Cassius were warmly received by the Athenians, who, according to Dio, decreed bronze statues of them next to Harmodios and Aristogeiton. Not by Harmodios and Aristogeiton in our case, but the liberty granted Asandros to locate his statue otherwise where he wishes in the Agora is striking. This may serve as an antidote to any inclination we may have to assume tight control of the public space of the Agora by the polis, or a regimented placement of statues in particular locations. And John Marr, in his book, notes parallels for this from other cities. I wonder, however, personally, whether this lack of control by the collective over the placing of the statue would have been tolerated in the classical democracy before 321. Another notable provision of the decree that I didn't give much attention to in my 2000 edition, but which now seems to be interesting, is that Asandros' statue is to be on horseback. You'll see F. Hippu, line 31. Now, it seems that this is the earliest, believe it or not, public honorific statue in Athens known to have had this pose, and one of, if not the earliest in Greece. There is an inscription from Delphi, which is generally taken to imply that there were equestrian statues of the Phocian generals Philomelos and Onomakos at Delphi before 352, though in fact when you look at the text of the inscription, it separates out the honorans and their horses, and it's unclear whether the honorans were actually depicted mounted. The connotation of the equestrian statue seems to be military leadership. Honorific equestrian statues were later almost exclusively restricted to Hellenistic kings, and as Biard, the French scholar, has noted in his recent study, the type perhaps had specifically Macedonian connotations. In 307, Demetrius of Phaleron was ousted, and democracy was restored, in inverted commas, under the aegis of his and Asandros' enemy, Antigonus, and his son Demetrius Poliorcetes. Reacting, it seems, against the dearth of inscribed decrees under the previous regime, the Athenians revived their traditional epigraphical habit along with their ancestral constitution. Scores of inscribed assembly decrees are extant from the years 307 to 301, more than from any comparable period of Athenian history. And one of them is the second assembly decree in the BSA's collection. Significantly, it honors not a member of the international elite, like Asandros, but a board of ordinary Athenian officials who held office in proper democratic fashion for a single year, 3043 BC. The decree, as preserved, begins in mid-sentence, and the text specifying the office they held is lost. But in a sense, that's not very important. What is more interesting is that in its ethos and almost every detail of its wording, this decree could have been passed in the last decades of the classical democracy, the 330s or 320s. This includes emphasis on the key democratic principle of accountability. The officials are stated in line 5 to have rendered their accounts according to the law. Decrees honouring Athenian officials in the last phase of the classical democracy had carefully specified that the honours were subject to or followed the completion of the accounting process. As Edward Harris has recently noted, the only difference was that now the decrees were normally only inscribed after the process had been completed. In fact, there are two references to adherence to the law in close succession in lines 3 to 5 of the decree. In line 3, the gold crowns awarded to the officials are also said to be according to the law. As I've recently pointed out, there had been an increasing emphasis on the democratic principle of the rule of law in the decrees of the last phase of the classical democracy. The restored democracy of 3076 carried out a revision of the laws, which we are informed about in a decree honouring a man named Euchares of Conthylae for his work in writing them up. The precise scope of this legislative activity is obscure, but it seems likely that these were laws which re-established the democratic systems after the interruption of Demetrius of Phaleron's regime. What hasn't been noticed before, and I didn't notice it myself when I edited this inscription in 2000, is that the double reference to adherence to the law in this decree it coincides with the date of the decree honouring Euchares of Conthylae for writing up the laws, which was passed in the very same year as our Board of Officials held office, 3043 BC. This is surely unlikely to be coincidental. We may infer that a crucial aspect of the democratic ideology being celebrated in the inscriptions of this year was the democratic principle of the rule of law. Inscription number 4 on the list takes us forward in time nearly 3 centuries. It's the base of a statue set up apparently by a Roman with the cognomen Proculus, see Proclos in the last line, commemorating the 7th hoplite generalship of one of the leading Athenians of the Augustan period, Antipatros, son of Antipatros of Phleia. The abundant evidence for whom, entirely epigraphical, has now been conveniently set out by Sean Byrne in his 2003 publication, Roman Citizens of Athens. In addition to several monuments commemorating his term as hoplite general, including another one commemorating his 7th term, Antipatros proposed a decree about the celebration of Augustus' birthday in 22 BC, probably, perhaps when hoplite general for the 4th time. And he was the probable owner of 3 slaves named on a funerary monument as having perished in a shipwreck, where they are referred to as Vipsanii. This last, together with the fact that Antipatros' descendants are named Vipsanius, shows that the family was awarded the Roman citizenship under the patronage of Augustus' lieutenant, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. And Byrne has attractively suggested that this was on the occasion of Agrippa's likely visit to Athens in 16 BC, when he probably instituted the building of the Odeon, or Agrippeion, in the Agora. Byrne suggests that Agrippa's visit and the award of Roman citizenship to Antipatros coincided with Antipatros' 7th generalship, in other words, with the very generalship commemorated on the base in the BSA's collection. The non-use of his Roman name on an Athenian civic monument would not be especially unusual, though the chronology is not quite clear, and it's also possible that Antipatros' 7th generalship fell a year or two earlier than the putative citizenship grant in 16 BC. Whatever the precise timing, this makes Antipatros the earliest leading native-born Athenian known to be prominent in Athenian affairs, created a Roman citizen. An earlier case, Lysiades of Berenicidae, was enrolled by Antony as a juror in Rome in 44 BC, but is known only in a Roman context. Antony Sporforth, in his recent book on the Augustan Cultural Revolution, notes Lysiades and our Antipatros as 2 of 10 provincial grandees in Achaea, who were also Roman citizens as a result of grants from Caesar, Antony, Augustus, or members of his family, or from highly placed broker figures. Moving forward a couple of centuries in time, once again, numbers 5 and 6 are both dedications from the Imperial Roman period. Number 6, a dedication of the 2nd or 3rd century AD to the All-High God, which must be from the sanctuary to that deity that was established in the Roman period on the former meeting place of the assembly on the Pnyx, and this has attracted interest since my 2000 edition in the context of Stephen Mitchell's work on pagan monotheism. Number 5, a dedication to Eilithyia, the goddess of childbirth, must originally have been set up in one of the 2 or 3 known Athenian sanctuaries of this goddess. The dedication to Eilithyia was made by a father on behalf of his daughter, Julia Rufina. From other epigraphical evidence for the persons named on this inscription, it can be established that Julia Rufina was the newborn baby daughter, not the baby's mother. And at the other end of her life, in around 220 AD, she was honored by her husband, and 2 of her sons are also known. As I noted in 2000, it seems that the text of this dedication was first drafted using the baby's cognomen only, Rufina. You see there in the 3rd line, the name by which she would have been known in the family. But on second thoughts, her father Optatus decided that for form's sake, her official nomen, Julia, should also be included, and this was squeezed in as an afterthought, running over from the end of line 2 to the beginning of line 3. The absence of the mother from this dedication is notable, but we don't know whether she dedicated separately or perhaps even had died in childbirth. We take a step back in time again with number 7, a list of men on a wall block datable to the early 1st century BC, probably donors to some building project. Of the 11 names, 5 are identifiable as from prominent Athenian families of the period. And also interesting is that we have 2 Romans in lines 5 to 6, making here one of their earliest appearances in Attic epigraphy: Marcus, son of Marcus of Rome, and Lucius, son of Lucius of Rome. From its prosopography, the inscription can be dated to the unsettled decade, the first decade of the 2nd century BC, and the first decade of the 1st century BC, 100 to 90 BC. And the 2 Romans no doubt reflect the close ties that existed before Athens' decision in 88 to break with Rome and support Mithridates, and the consequent sacking of the city of Athens by Sulla in 86 BC. The BSA has no less than 7 Attic funerary monuments. The first 2 in the list, numbers 8 and 9 on the handout, face visitors to the BSA as they come through the front door at the back of the entrance hall on either side of the fireplace, and both date to the 4th century BC. As I showed in my 2000 article, but hadn't fully recognized before, this hadn't been fully recognized before, the pair is closely related. The anthemia are broadly similar in design, and the lettering is so close that we can probably infer that the cutter was identical. They were also found together in central Athens near the German Institute. Almost certainly, therefore, they are contemporary or near contemporary products of the same workshop, albeit that on one the persons named are depicted in relief, and on the other they were originally shown in paint, and they may well derive from the same funerary enclosure. Accordingly, the persons on the 2 stelae named may have been related, though their names give no hint of this. None of the persons named on either of these monuments is otherwise known or identifiable, and at a time when a high proportion of the most wealthy and prominent Athenians are known from abundant literary and epigraphical evidence, this is consistent perhaps with this family's belonging to a more modest middle class, which, as Daniela Marchiandi has elucidated in her 2011 study, was typically represented on this type of funerary monument. Around 500 examples of this kind of 4th century Attic funerary monument depicting individuals in a relief or sometimes painted panel are extant. Since I wrote in 2000, Posamantia has published in 2006 an excellent study of the painted monuments, though unfortunately he doesn't include the BSA example, applying new photographic technology to bring out the painted scenes and confirming that the type of scene that they represent is usually similar to that illustrated in the reliefs. The relief on number 8 depicts a scene of dexiosis between a standing Mitope and a seated Mylene. Claremont takes the deceased to be the standing woman, depicted together with her mother to whom she bids a last farewell. But the significance of the dexiosis scene, which occurs in around half of all classical Bildfeldstelen depicting multiple figures, is now generally agreed to be a signifier of human intimacy, generally within the oikos, rather than specifically of greeting or farewell, as is the gesture of uncovering anacalypsis, which Mitope also performs. Last but not least, number 13, the other Attic funerary stele in the BSA entrance hall. The monument, whose provenance is not well documented, was published for the first time in my 2000 article and identified there by the late Geoffrey Waywell as a classicizing monument of the Augustan or Julio-Claudian periods. There's a close parallel in another funerary relief of a man and wife now in Munich, which is dated by von Muck to the 2nd quarter of the 1st century AD. The pose of the figures is identical, as are many details, including the painted bird, which once perched on the man's left forefinger. The names labeling the figures originally inscribed on the panel above the relief were erased in the late 2nd century AD and replaced with the inscriptions which are, with difficulty, still legible. The woman Aristion and her father Neophilos of Marathon are not otherwise known, but her husband is one Popilius Pius of Marathon, identifiable with the Popilius Pius whose Athenian citizenship qualifications were challenged and subsequently confirmed in a judgment of Marcus Aurelius, attested epigraphically in 14745 AD. At this stage, Popilius Pius's name will presumably also have been inscribed above the male figure to the left, though this was subsequently itself erased, perhaps by his enemies or iconoclasts, leaving only his demotic legible. One point that I didn't make in 2000, but make now in response to Simone Follet's remarks on my publication in the Bulletin Epigraphique, is that this type of reuse of funerary monuments is not at all unusual in this period. There are several examples in von Much's collection of figurative monuments of the Roman period in which monuments of the Augustan and Julio-Claudian period are reused in the 2nd century AD. As I noted in 2000, it is tempting to interpret the appropriation and reinscription of this funerary monument of the Augustan Julio-Claudian period, with its classicizing relief harking back to the 4th century BC, as a symbolic assertion in death of the quality of lineage which Popilius's enemies had challenged while he was alive. That's all I have to say this evening, but I should finish by expressing warm thanks to the institutions that have supported AIO, in particular Cardiff and Utrecht universities and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, whose logos appear on this screen, but to 2 institutions that do not, the University of Heidelberg, from whose excellent library AIO has benefited immensely, and last but not least, the BSA, whose staff have been wonderfully supportive and whose library has been crucially important to my work over the years, as I said at the start. And finally, I take this opportunity to thank warmly all the individuals who have collaborated on AIO over the first 5 years of its life, both as members of our advisory board, as translators and authors, and on the technical side behind the scenes. Several of these names belong to people here in the room tonight, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to acknowledge their invaluable contributions in person. Thank you very much.